I was 18, I started working for Rick Baker on Michael Jackson's Thriller. I was a college student thinking I could do both, not realizing how all-encompassing film stuff is, and eventually dropped out of school. I started working for Rick. The 4-week job turned into 4 years. Stan got Aliens. Alien had been an inspiration for me to get into this. I went over to Stan's. I worked on Aliens. I worked with Greg Canham on Lost Boys and Cocoon. At Rick's we did Girls in the Mist. I think the last thing I did with him was Harry and the Hendersons. Maybe it was Girls in the Mist. It's so long ago. Basically, I had worked at a lot of other shops. I'd done a couple of little things on my own. I had done this half-corpse character for Return of the Living Dead. And that was sort of my first like standalone thing. But it was literally one character in a film. And I did a couple other little things on it, on that same film. But I was sort of off to the side of the true filmmaking experience on that one. And then when The Blob came up, I interviewed along with a bunch of other people. I saw people that I'd worked with on other crews coming out of Chuck Russell's place when I was going in. So I'm like, all right, well, he's obviously looking at everybody, so this is kind of cool, because I didn't have much standalone kind of stuff. When I did Return of the Living Dead, I asked Rick if I could use his shop and work in the evenings. We were actually doing Cocoon in his shop for Greg Canham at the time. So I paid Rick some rent and paid for some supplies and did the half corpse at Rick's shop at night. I just had all the stuff up in the attic and I'd pull it down and I'd work on it after everybody went home on Cocoon. That was my night job. But I built like the split dogs in my kitchen in my apartment in Hollywood. So it was like wherever I could work with whatever I had, and time was a big factor, obviously. So I took stuff, I had stuff at home, I had stuff at the shop, and weekends were wherever, you know, but it was basically 24/7 kind of a job for a couple weeks on that. And then when The Blob came around, it sort of turned into the same sort of thing where Chuck was saying, well, we're going to go with this guy and he's going to do the show, but we'd love to have you do a couple of these other effects in it because he's not necessarily quite as interested in those things. It was the projectionist on the ceiling, and I don't remember. It was one or two other things. I went in just enthusiastic that I was getting my first opportunity to work on something. I was 24 years old, and I'd worked at other shops, and this was my chance to do something on my own. So I went in with just the attitude that, you know, whatever they want me to do, wherever they want me to be, I'll follow suit. And then things turned upside down pretty quick, and suddenly I was doing the lion's share of it, and they were asking me to find somebody to do the stuff that I was going to do. And I'm like, well, how are we going to make sure it all looks the same? Why don't we just bring them into the same building? And then it just turned into me in charge of the victims and everything else. And my attitude was, let's try and do stuff that's really different and cool. And, you know, this was the time where people were really up for anything. I mean, The Thing, you know, was a great example of the script says this, but what do you think of this sort of thing? So we went in with a little bit of that, and it was a very collaborative experience, so it worked out really well. Resources and reference weren't readily available, so when we wanted to watch the original Blob to see what it was all about, somebody had a VHS copy somewhere that was like already old, you know, and then a bunch of us sat down and watched it, and it's like, okay, well, it's just Jell-O, and it's like, what are we gonna do to make this more interesting? And then, I mean, the terror comes from the faces of the people that are in it, and trying to relate to them, which the script allows you to do great, but seeing the terror through their eyes and making this thing horrific to them. And then if we get to mess with their faces, all the better. So we kind of tried to pull from all sorts of different reference material. I mean, it was really the sky's the limit at that point because there was no victim in any of the first film. I mean, you didn't see anything happen to anybody. You saw somebody get covered over with some slime, and that was it. They were gone. And we looked at it as a chance to show the people dissolving and melting and coming apart and being absorbed into this thing. And there were no digital effects at the time. So it was all really about how do we manage this practically. And as the pre-production period went on, I also ended up in charge of the blob wherever it overlapped the victim. So like Donovan Leitch's scene where the very first kill, we actually shot last because the idea was, let's take some time to learn what we're doing and how all this stuff works and the best way to work with all of it. And let's shoot the very first kill in the movie, the very last, so we can use all of our resources and our knowledge and be smart about this. And it really helped make a difference. We realized early on that the material is super unwieldy and super heavy. So how do we manage that if Chuck's storyboard shot is a wide shot where the blob is pulling back and going out the windowsill and Shawnee Smith is holding on to Donovan's hand and pulling the opposite direction. It's a two shot and you're seeing all this stuff going on. The only way to really pull it off was in miniature. So we did a little miniature of Shawnee and one of Donovan and one of the blob front, which was the section that he was in. And then we had this thing, we call it the waterfall. That was this section of the blob that went over the windowsill and out. And it was the two were completely separate because we had these layers of material moving over the surface so that you always saw movement within the blob. It was never sort of a static figure. So the waterfall was kind of working in reverse and the stuff was flowing out the window. And then you had this thing on Donovan, or on the puppet in this instance, where the stuff is being pulled around the front and over top and behind him as it's being pulled, as he's being pulled out. But we had different miniature puppets of him. We had different like sort of substructures to the blob to make that work. And all that stuff sort of helped us with the last bit of effects work that we had to do, sort of like the last week of the show, where we're doing inserts and stuff like that. We really learned a lot working at a smaller scale. It was just so manageable. You know, it's almost like we wished we'd done some of that stuff earlier on. We all had so much work to do in so little time. It was great that it was divided. And it was great that we were in the same building so we could compare notes or chime in. We were all in our 20s, you know, most of us, and all sort of knew each other to some degree. All liked each other, all hung out. So when Bill Corso walked out with this weird bag of shapes that was rolling down his hands that had form to it, it wasn't just a bag of slime. There were forms in it and veins and stuff like that. We're like, that's cool. That's what we need to figure out how to incorporate into what we're doing with the victims so that the things overlap and make sense. And by the time we got to the end and got to Donovan's death, we'd taken the idea that, like Bill Corso and those guys did, with clear spheres inside these silk bags that had veins painted on them. And we'd actually done these fiberglass shapes that we were draping their idea of the blob quilts over top of, so that we could get the shapes we need that could hold a person in them, and then we could use the material and resources that they were using on the surface. And then we added some layers underneath and a couple things on top of it. But it was kind of like this collaborative thing that sort of like ebb and flow as the project moved forward. When we got to the projectionist in the ceiling, we had a 4x8 panel in the ceiling, literally the size of a piece of plywood, that was a frame that was supported by a frame that actually pulled out. And on that frame, we built this stretched out guy as a puppet that we could hang from the ceiling, from this iron scaffolding in the ceiling. And the blob shop proper built this frame that fit around that had the undulating mass of the blob itself and some mechanical tentacles. Then we had to overlap those two sections together and make sure there was room up top for our guys to be the hand with the yo-yo, and then also puppeteer the head and the other hand and stuff like that. But that there was also space around that for Mark Shatrakian's motors for the tentacle rotation and stuff like that. So there was always overlap. And I remember the night before the projectionist shot, we were literally all of us, like from both sides of the shop, just sitting on this tabletop that had the ceiling stretched out on it upside down, attaching all this stuff and seaming and gluing and painting, just as this big sort of collaborative mess. And then I don't know that any of us actually slept that night. I think we loaded it into a truck. I think we literally rolled up the sides over top of the body, loaded it into the back of a truck, and drove it up to set, and then flipped it upside down and mounted it to that ceiling, and then shot it. The nice thing was there was really no heavy makeup that day because the head was a animatronic head, so we didn't have to like be going, oh, is this blending edge look okay? Because we were so tired. But it was just one of those shows where it was super ambitious and there was a lot of stuff everybody wanted to do, and I just found the piece of paper that had the budget for the show, and it blew my mind how little we actually had to work with. And we only had a few months to do it. I think one of the things that most of us were really into and wondering if we were actually going to be able to do was killing Eddie, because it was a kid and you just weren't supposed to kill kids in films. Granted, he goes underwater and you don't see anything that happens to him, but the shock of him coming out and then getting yanked back down, we wanted to do something really graphic with that. We built on what we had done on Sheriff Geller floating by outside the phone booth. You know, we did a water tank puppet that had some mechanics in it that made the face collapse in as it's going by. And we had tentacles and tendrils of fabric with veins painted on them that sort of strung out behind him. So it looked like he was sort of dissolving into this material, into the interior of the blob, basically. So we did the same thing with Eddie, but it was a shock thing. So we went for a very extreme face already starting to dissolve because the creature's bigger and stronger now. That was my justification. And then we had him on all these tethers and stuff, and then stunt department had Bobby Porter on a jerk line so that he could come out and really try and get forward and then very violently be pulled under.
Come on, answer!
The phone booth that Candy Clark is in that implodes, there was the practical full-size phone booth, and there was a full-size dummy of Candy Clark in the pose trying to hold the sides together before it explodes. Then they had also built a miniature phone booth and a miniature Candy Clark. We had nothing to do with that one, actually. That you only saw from like the top down. And then the real phone booth, they would take the blob quilts and sort of put those down the sides of it. And you could actually see the material and the mass of the stuff, you know, using its weight to its advantage, coming down the sides around her head. Then we cut to basically a giant fish tank that I'm standing inside with this puppet head of Sheriff Geller. And I'm literally standing 2 feet behind Candy, but we'd put like milk in the water to sort of make it go a little more opaque and a little more whitish. And then some red food coloring. And that gave it enough depth where the face of the puppet could kind of come from nowhere and like push up against the glass and hit it and then slide. And as it slides away, we had these mechanisms in it that could roll the eyes up and then also collapse the side of the face in. And it's really just a shock value sort of thing with that puppet. And then when the blob is pressing down on it, they literally just shot air mortars through the blob quilt at the phone booth, both of them full-size and miniature, and then edited something really super violent out of it. I mean, it's really getting hit with a lot of force. You know, the dummy and everything's reacting. And there's also stuff that we did that didn't make it into the film because of like technical issues. We had done the sheriff outside of the phone booth as a water tank puppet, and after Dr. Meadows' head helmet fills up with the blob and he gets sucked down. Like, wouldn't it be cool if Dr. Meadows would come back when Kevin's underneath the blob, when he's in the truck, the truck's turned over, the blob has encompassed the truck. It's like, wouldn't it be cool if you could see out the windshield and see Dr. Meadows go by and a couple other people, and they're all, like, the blob is so strong at this point, they're just like skeletons that are clear and like glittery, like it's like this weird kind of like literally acid trip kind of thing. So he built all these puppets of clear skeletons where they're all distorted and the jaws are really long. We sculpted them like they're going through water and stuff's being dragged behind them. And they filled the tank outside. They used the actual windshield for the truck as one side of the water tank. Well, it's curved on the outside, and it didn't last overnight. The next morning, it had cracked overnight, and then the whole thing had blown out. They'd filled it the night before, so all the bubbles and stuff would be gone. And then we got in that day, and it's like, well, there's no water tank. We don't think we're going to be able to do that. And then they talked briefly about doing it as a green screen thing. And then, like I described earlier, the end of the shoot was so crazy. There was so little time to get all the pieces. That was one of the pieces that went by the wayside. We realized, well, we got into a lot of conversations very early on about what is an X rating. And it really came down to blood. And when Donovan's arm gets pulled out of his, elbow socket, when Shawnee's pulling on him as his body's going out the window, blood shoots out. And we're seeing blood in motion. And they reacted most violently against that moment than anything else because we were seeing spraying red blood. So we talked about, well, can things turn different colors? What can we do? And then we realized, well, this is a living organism that is dissolving people. Let's make its main meal the blood, and maybe that's the driving force behind what it's doing. So that started to dictate the approach for what they'd look like. Their skin going clear, all the blood being pulled out of their body, and the blob getting pinker as it grows. The body's getting paler as the film goes on, and as you're seeing each death, there's less involved. We took the idea that your fingernails and your hair and your teeth and your bones weren't organic material that the blob would be interested in. So that would sort of be left behind, like if an acid was dissolving a body. I did this horrible interview. Well, it's a horrible quote from an interview where I was trying to describe it as a very acidic organism, like imagine like stomach lining, but it's on the outside of this organism, and if you touch it, it's going to pull you into it, and it's going to dissolve. It's going to go for your blood, and it's going to dissolve your skin and try and get more. That was really what we all sort of looked at the beginning. So this thing was aggressive in its movement, and it had a very specific appetite. And through that appetite, we eliminated the need for blood streaming out of the sheriff's head as he, floated by outside the phone booth. And I think the X rating sort of went out the window as a result of that. But if you notice on this scene where the arm gets pulled out of the socket, you see that blood spurt for literally like half a second. I think it was a time limit where it would qualify as an X. So you're out of it almost immediately, and then when the camera switches angles, there is no more blood coming, and the blob's that much further moved through the scene already. Well, the nicest part for me was going to the screening and seeing that they'd given me a front card on the film, because I was like the new guy, and I had nothing in my contract. And seeing the film and then seeing my name come up before the name of the film I was floored, and I was so appreciative. It was like such a hard show to do, and then that was such a nice way for them to say thank you, and that really helped solidify me as a makeup effects guy. And the show at the same time taught me that I liked running a shop, and I enjoyed working with people, and I liked problem solving, and there's never going to be anything but problems. So, I realized that I could really embrace it, and 30 years later, I'm still running a shop, and some of the guys that were in the blob shop are still working with me, and are still in the business, and are still doing amazing stuff. So, the blob had longevity, and so did the makeup effects crew.